Nebraska Sand Hills, autumn of 1899. An endless sweep of wind-carved dunes rolls beneath a pale sky, each hill draped in tall, gold-flecked prairie grass that moves like waves across a silent ocean. The wind never truly stops here. It hisses through the stems, lifts dust from the ridges, and reminds every homesteader that winter comes early, stays long, and shows mercy to no one. Families rush across the landscape, hauling logs, stacking sod, patching dugouts before the temperatures fall for good. Their movements are hurried, anxious, as if they can feel the cold already gathering beyond the horizon. And then there is one man working at a different rhythm. Anders Halvorsen, a tall Norwegian immigrant with calm, deliberate hands, stacks massive compressed grass bales into thick rising walls. Each block is set with purpose. Each corner is measured twice. Where others hear the wind and worry, Anders listens to it, studies it, treats it almost like a teacher. His neighbors pause to stare, exchanging smirks and muttered jokes. A house made of hay? In the Sand Hills? They call it foolish. They call him poor. They call the project a barn, pretending to be a home. But Anders keeps building. He studies the angle of the sunlight, the way the ground settles under each bale, the behavior of the wind curling around the structure. He remembers winters in Telemark, cold that could hollow a man out if he didn't understand how heat behaves. He knows something the others do not yet see. Survival is not about tradition, it is about physics. As the prairie stretches silent around him, Anders' strange house begins to rise, steady, solid, and completely at odds with everything the frontier believes about shelter. No one knows it yet, but when the coming winter bares its teeth, those walls will stand between life and death. And the Sand Hills will remember the man who dared to build differently. Long before Anders Halvorsen ever set foot in the Sand Hills, hardship had already shaped the way he looked at the world. He was born in Telemark, Norway, a land of steep valleys, biting winds, and winters that pressed against a home like a living thing. In that place, survival wasn't about having the right materials. It was about understanding how heat moved, how wind behaved, how a wall either fought the cold or surrendered to it. As a young man, Anders apprenticed in small mountain villages where carpenters built cabins thick as fortress walls. They layered timber not for beauty, but for performance. They positioned fireboxes at the center of a home to trap every precious degree of warmth. From hunters and herders, Anders learned to observe the natural world, how reindeer bedded down in snowbanks for insulation, how farmers stored grain in thick-walled sheds to protect it through freezing nights. By the time he reached his 20s, Anders had spent more hours studying cold weather than most men spent studying books. When he immigrated to America, he found work in the Minnesota lumber camps. Long days cutting timber, longer nights listening to men argue about how to build a home that could stand a northern winter. Anders studied the cabins he helped construct, noting their weaknesses: thin walls, drafty joints, fires placed poorly. Americans, he realized, built according to tradition, not environment. The frontier did not reward that kind of thinking. When opportunity finally led him west to Nebraska, Anders arrived expecting challenge. But even he was surprised by what he found: a land with almost no timber, soil too sandy for sod houses, and hills that channeled wind like a funnel. Yet everywhere, stretching to the horizon, stood miles of tall prairie grass, dense, fibrous, and swaying like a golden sea. As he ran his hands through the stems, their light but resilient structure reminded him of something familiar: the hollow fibers his father once used to insulate cold storage sheds back in Norway. Materials did not have to be strong to be warm. They only needed to trap still air. Standing in that sea of grass, Anders felt something click into place. While every other settler cursed the lack of trees, Anders saw walls. Walls the wind could not penetrate, walls that, if built thick enough, might outmatch both log and sod in insulating power. It was not madness. It was memory. It was physics. It was survival learned the hard way. And in time, the whole county would learn what Anders had always known. Sometimes the land gives you exactly what you need, if only you're willing to see it. Long before Anders Halvorsen ever set foot in the Sand Hills, hardship had already shaped the way he looked at the world. He was born in Telemark, Norway, a land of steep valleys, biting winds, and winters that pressed against a home like a living thing. In that place, survival wasn't about having the right materials. It was about understanding how heat moved, how wind behaved, how a wall either fought the cold or surrendered to it. As a young man, Anders apprenticed in small mountain villages where carpenters built cabins thick as fortress walls. They layered timber not for beauty, but for performance. They positioned fireboxes at the center of a home to trap every precious degree of warmth. From hunters and herders, Anders learned to observe the natural world, how reindeer bedded down in snowbanks for insulation, how farmers stored grain in thick-walled sheds to protect it through freezing nights. By the time he reached his 20s, Anders had spent more hours studying cold weather than most men spent studying books. When he immigrated to America, he found work in the Minnesota lumber camps. Long days cutting timber, longer nights listening to men argue about how to build a home that could stand a northern winter. Anders studied the cabins he helped construct, noting their weaknesses: thin walls, drafty joints, fires placed poorly. Americans, he realized, built according to tradition, not environment. The frontier did not reward that kind of thinking. When opportunity finally led him west to Nebraska, Anders arrived expecting challenge. But even he was surprised by what he found: a land with almost no timber, soil too sandy for sod houses, and hills that channeled wind like a funnel. Yet everywhere, stretching to the horizon, stood miles of tall prairie grass, dense, fibrous, and swaying like a golden sea. As he ran his hands through the stems, their light but resilient structure reminded him of something familiar: the hollow fibers his father once used to insulate cold storage sheds back in Norway. Materials did not have to be strong to be warm. They only needed to trap still air. Standing in that sea of grass, Anders felt something click into place. While every other settler cursed the lack of trees, Anders saw walls. Walls the wind could not penetrate, walls that, if built thick enough, might outmatch both log and sod in insulating power. It was not madness. It was memory. It was physics. It was survival learned the hard way. And in time, the whole county would learn what Anders had always known. Sometimes the land gives you exactly what you need, if only you're willing to see it. By midsummer of 1898, while other settlers hammered boards and notched logs, Anders Halvorsen began what many considered the strangest construction project the county had ever seen. Every morning, he walked out to the patch of cleared ground behind his homestead, studying the slope, the prevailing winds, and the way shadows moved across the land. He treated the site not as a place to build a house, but as an equation he needed to solve. The first step was the foundation. Anders laid flat stones, gathered from creek beds miles away, into a raised platform 8 inches above the soil. Neighbors watched him labor for days, muttering that no sane man would spend that much time on a house made of hay. But Anders understood moisture. He had seen what a wet winter did to buildings in Norway. He had watched rock claim cabins from the ground up. So he built upward, away from the earth, ensuring his walls would never wick water. When the foundation was firm, Anders hauled the first bale into position, a dense, golden block compressed with a weight that surprised anyone who tried lifting it. He placed it gently, adjusting its angle until it sat perfectly square. Then another, and another. Each layer was arranged in a running bond pattern, like bricks in a fortress wall. Every joint staggered, every seam aligned for strength. Throughout the long days, Anders worked silently, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, his breath steady as he drove long wooden pins, sharpened by hand, straight through multiple courses of bales. The pins locked the structure into a single cohesive mass, a living wall. Children gathered at a distance, whispering, their eyes wide. Would it collapse? Would mice move in? Would the first windstorm scatter the whole thing across the prairie? Adults were less gentle. One afternoon, Jim Caldwell rode by and reined in his horse, staring at the rising walls. "You building a barn or a joke, Anders?" he called out. Anders only smiled. "Barns stay warm in winter," he replied softly, but kept working. Another day, the local blacksmith shook his head as he passed. "Biggest waste of good hay I've seen," he muttered loud enough for Anders to hear. Even the postmaster's wife chimed in, declaring the structure an embarrassment to decent folk. But Anders never lifted his gaze to answer. He had built under harsher eyes in the lumber camps, and he had learned early that innovation was rarely welcomed by those who feared being proven wrong. As the walls rose, Anders prepared the mixture that would become the house's skin, a heavy, sticky blend of clay, chopped straw, and sand, what the old pioneers called gumbo mud. He spread the plaster over wire mesh with slow, sweeping strokes. With each pass, the walls transformed from rough bales into a smooth, dense surface that felt more like stone than grass. From a distance, the structure looked ordinary, almost like a thick-walled adobe house. But up close, Anders could feel its solidity, its silence, its refusal to echo even the loudest hammer strike. Reverend Samuel Weaver rode by one afternoon and watched Anders work in the amber light. "Thickness matters more than beauty when the cold comes," the preacher said. Anders nodded. "A wall is not judged by the eye," he replied, "but by what it keeps out and what it keeps in." Despite this rare voice of support, most of the community continued their quiet ridicule. As autumn neared, bets circulated about how long Anders's haystack house would last. Some said it would collapse before the first frost. Others predicted mice would hollow it out. Anders heard every whisper carried on the wind. But he only pressed another bale into place, tightened another wooden pin, smoothed another line of clay across the wall. He did not build for their approval. He built for the winter he knew was coming. By late autumn of 1898, the Sand Hills began behaving in ways Anders Halvorsen did not like. He had lived long enough in cold country to know that winter never arrives suddenly. It sends warnings first, often subtle, often ignored by those who trust tradition more than observation. Anders watched every sign. He noticed the first snowfall settling 3 weeks earlier than normal, dusting the hills while cattle still grazed in open pasture. The newcomers brushed it off as a fluke, but Anders studied the flakes. Heavy, wet crystals that belonged to deeper winter, not October. Then the temperature dropped 15 degrees overnight, and did not rise again for days. Each morning, Anders walked the perimeter of his straw-bale walls, checking the plaster, testing the tightness of the bond between layers. The house held perfectly. The cold slid off it like water off a seal's back. But his eyes stayed on the horizon. One afternoon he stopped near the frozen edge of the Niobrara River. Ice already stretched across water that almost never froze solid. Anders crouched, his breath visible in the early dusk. He pressed a gloved hand to the surface, feeling how quickly cold was claiming the land. "Too early," he murmured. "Far too early." Across the hills, other settlers noticed changes too, but understood them differently. Jim Caldwell split firewood faster than ever, muttering that the winter seemed eager this year. Anders watched him from a distance, the man swinging his axe with a kind of nervous determination. Caldwell believed more could solve the problem. Anders knew otherwise. Heat was only as useful as the walls around it. At the schoolteacher's cabin, Anders saw frost forming inside her window frames. She laughed when she caught him glancing at it. "Oh, it's nothing," she said. "Just a draft." But Anders didn't laugh. Drafts become danger when the temperature decides not to return above freezing. By mid-November, even the old-timers, men who prided themselves on surviving previous hard years, began eyeing the sky more often. Anders joined them one evening near the Mercantile, listening quietly as they spoke in low voices. "Feels like 57, one muttered. "The animals sense something," another added. "Storms are building wrong this year." Anders said nothing, but the words settled heavily in his chest. He had seen animals behave strangely too. Horses refused to graze, pawing at frozen ground as though searching for a warning buried beneath it. Cattle huddled tighter at night. Even the prairie birds flew lower, crying sharply in the bitter wind. As December approached, the snow deepened beyond what settlers considered normal. Anders stood outside one morning, the sky a chalky white dome, the air unmoving, too still. He placed a hand on his straw wall, warm beneath his palm. "It will be tested," he whispered, because he could feel it coming. The kind of winter that didn't simply chill a man, but hunted him. The kind that punished every flaw in a cabin wall. Every misjudged decision, every ounce of confidence not backed by knowledge. While others kept working, convincing themselves that nature followed their calendars, Anders prepared quietly. He tightened the last wooden pins, checked the seals around his windows, stored his firewood indoors to keep it bone dry, and stood many evenings on his ridge, watching the sky the way a sailor watches a rising tide. The prairie had begun to change its face, and Anders Halvorsen knew winter was not simply coming. It was preparing its attack. January 21st, 1899 arrived deceptively calm. So calm that Anders Halvorsen felt the hair on his arms rise when he stepped outside that morning. The air carried a strange weight, a pressure he recognized from the winters of his childhood in Telemark. The kind of silence that felt less like peace and more like the breath before something breaks. By midday, Anders paused in his chores and looked northwest. A thin band of grey clouds gathered low on the horizon, too organized to be harmless. He studied the pattern, the movement, the speed. Clouds that should have drifted were advancing, pulled by a force he could sense even before the wind rose. At 2 p.m., the animals confirmed his fears. His horses paced nervously inside the corral, nostrils flaring, eyes wide. Cattle pressed against the windbreaks, as though seeking shelter from a storm that had not yet arrived. Anders walked among them, laying a hand on one horse's neck. It shivered, not from cold, but from instinct. "Ja, you feel it too," he whispered. At 4:30 p.m., the first blast of wind swept across the Sand Hills. It came not as a gentle warning gust, but as a sudden, violent shove, an unmistakable sign that the storm had crossed into the valley. Anders stood beside his straw-bale house, coat whipping, hair pulled by the gust, watching as loose snow began skating across the surface of the land. The temperature sank rapidly, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs. Within 30 minutes, the breeze escalated into 40 miles per hour winds. Snowflakes, dry, fine needle-like, slashed sideways across the prairie. Visibility collapsed as swirling white swallowed entire hillsides. The world shrank to a ghostly, howling tunnel. Anders circled his home one last time, testing the plaster with his palm. The wall felt solid, unmoved by the wind's fury. His design was holding, so far. By 6 p.m., the temperature plunged to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind roared at 50 miles per hour. The storm had fully arrived. Through the blinding snow, Anders could barely see the outlines of his neighbors' cabins. In the dimming light, he caught glimpses of figures wrestling with shutters, stuffing blankets against gaps, dragging firewood through drifts already knee-deep. He wanted to help, God knew he did, but he also knew the truth. No man can fight a storm of this scale in the open. He retreated inside, securing the heavy wooden door with its hand-forged latch. His children looked up, worried, as the chimney moaned with the force of the gale. Anders spoke calmly, reassuring them, though his own heartbeat had quickened. "This house will hold," he said, laying a hand on the warm interior wall. "It was built for nights like this." Outside, the storm hammered the settlement. Anders watched through the small window as the world disappeared into a spinning white void. He could feel the power of the wind shaking the earth itself. In distant flashes, tiny silhouettes illuminated by lanterns, he saw neighbors still battling the storm. Jim Caldwell's log cabin trembled under the constant pressure. Snow blew through the chinking like flour from a sieve. Amelia Vance's frame house bent with each gust, its thin boards breathing in and out, as if the whole structure was struggling to stay alive. The Schmidt's dugout was already frosting over. Anders pictured the moist earth walls turning into sheets of ice. He clenched his jaw. There was nothing he could do for them now, not until the storm allowed movement. Night fell, and the blizzard intensified. Wind speeds neared 55 miles per hour, howling like a wounded animal. Snow accumulated against buildings faster than the wind could sweep it away, forming drifts that climbed halfway up windows in a matter of hours. Inside Anders's home, the storm was barely a whisper, thick straw-bale walls absorbing the violence like a sponge. His fire burned low but steady. The temperature remained comfortably warm. Yet Anders did not sleep. He sat by the window, listening, watching, feeling the weight of responsibility in his chest. He knew what the others had built. He knew their weaknesses. And he knew some would not survive the night unless they reached his door when the worst passed. He prayed silently. Hold them through the dark. Let them make it to morning. Because the storm had only begun to show its teeth. And Anders Halvorsen understood, better than anyone else on the prairie, that the true test, of wood, of sod, of soil, of straw, of men, was still ahead. The storm reached its murderous peak after midnight. Anders Halvorsen stood inside his dimly lit straw-bale home, lantern in hand, listening to the blizzard batter the prairie with a fury that seemed almost personal. The walls around him did not tremble. The fire needed no tending. His children slept warmly beneath wool blankets. But Anders did not rest. Every few minutes he stepped to the window, one of the few in the settlement that wasn't rimmed with ice, and peered into the vast, swirling white. The storm turned the world into a restless void. Nothing stayed still. Snow moved sideways in long, ghost-like ribbons. The wind shrieked and clawed at the land as if trying to rip the very soil away. He whispered to himself, "No timber cabin can withstand this. Not this sustained pressure." He had warned them. He wished he had been wrong. Caldwell's cabin begins to fail around 1 a.m., through the violent flicker of blowing snow. Anders saw a faint orange burst. Firelight, not from a hearth, but from a lantern swung frantically. Jim Caldwell's silhouette moved inside his log cabin, shadows jerking wildly across the walls. Anders pressed closer to the window, heart kicking. He could see it even from a distance. The north wall, exposed fully to the storm, was leaking snow so heavily it looked as if the cabin were breathing frozen air. Jim shoved blankets into the cracks, but each time he blocked one opening. A new fissure appeared. His wife ran from wall to wall, her breath fogging in the air, their youngest boy wrapped in quilts beside the hearth. The stone chimney, built proud and tall, was their undoing. Anders watched the chimney belch smoke downward. In this wind, it could not draw properly. Smoke filled the room. Jim stumbled as he coughed violently. The last thing Anders saw before the snow swallowed the cabin again was the family dragging their furniture closer to the fire, burning anything they could lift. Anders closed his eyes, jaw tightening. Hold on, Jim. Just hold on until daylight. Amelia Vance's frame house cannot keep its shape at 1:30 a.m. A deep cracking sound rolled across the storm. So loud Anders felt it through the floor. He rushed back to the window. Amelia Vance's frame house, a structure so thin Anders always compared it to a fruit crate, was bending under the wind like a bowstring. One plank at a time, the boards flexed inward, then snapped outward. Snow forced its way through hairline gaps, swirling inside the home like dust in a barn. Amelia herself appeared at the doorway for a moment, lantern in one hand, coat wrapped tight around her trembling body. She looked toward Anders's home, the only structure standing dark, silent, unmoved by the gale, then back at the collapsing wall behind her. She slammed the door shut and braced a chair against it. Anders's stomach twisted. He knew she would eventually have to run for her life. He also knew the storm would kill her within minutes if she tried now. "Stay alive, Amelia," he murmured. "Just stay alive until the wind breaks." The dugouts turned to frozen tombs by 2:15 a.m. Anders began noticing something else. Silent. Eerie flashes of reflected light beneath the snowdrifts. The dugout family's lanterns. He wiped frost from the window, breath shallow. The moisture inside those underground homes would be turning to ice sheets. Walls freezing from the inside. Fires struggling to stay lit. He'd seen it once in Minnesota as a young man. He knew the smell of cold soil, the deadly stillness that overtakes a dugout in deep winter. And then he saw movement. The Schmidt's lantern bobbed erratically. A figure stumbled past the dugout entrance, then vanished from sight. Anders pressed his forehead to the glass. Heart pounding. God help them, they're losing heat faster than they can create it. His own walls remained warm beneath his hand. Alive, breathing slowly, steady as bedrock. The sod house gives way. The worst came at 2:40 a.m. A thunderous crash rippled through the blizzard, an unmistakable sound of something large surrendering to the storm. Anders threw open the inside latch and stepped halfway out into the entryway, the wind nearly ripping the door from his grasp. Through the maelstrom, he saw a shape collapse in on itself, like a sandcastle under a kicked wave. The German family's sod house had failed. Thick blocks of frozen dirt sheared away. The roof sagged inward. A lantern flared, then went out. The family appeared in brief, nightmarish flashes, dragging children toward their wagon, shielding them with blankets. Stumbling in waist-deep snow, Anders screamed into the storm, though no one could hear him. "Run to me. Come to the house. Follow the chimney light." He rushed back inside and pushed more wood into the fire, so the glow might guide them. His wife grabbed his arm. Terrified, he might attempt to go out. "You cannot survive that wind," she whispered. He knew she was right. All he could do was keep the house lit, keep hope visible. Inside Anders's home, a different reality entirely. By 3 a.m., the storm reached maximum rage. 55 miles per hour winds, 22 degrees Fahrenheit air, snow like knives. Yet inside the Halvorsen home, the temperature held at a steady, astonishing warmth. The straw-bale walls did exactly what Anders designed them to do. No drafts, no groaning beams, no shaking walls, no infiltration of snow or wind. His children slept. His wife knitted with trembling hands to calm her nerves. The lantern flame did not flicker. But Anders could not look away from the window. He watched his neighbors fight for survival in structures that tradition had taught them to trust. And that tradition was failing them one by one. He whispered to himself, voice breaking for the first time that night. "Tomorrow, if they can make it to morning, I will open this door to every last one of them." A night of suffering, a night of waiting. The hours crawled. The prairie howled. Anders kept vigil at the glass, hand on his insulated wall, praying the others would survive long enough to reach him once the storm eased. Because he knew with absolute certainty, tonight proved which walls were strong, and which beliefs were stronger than sense. And when dawn came, the survivors would come to one place, to one home, to one man who had built against ridicule, against tradition, against the wind itself. When the storm finally broke, Just after dawn on January 22nd, the world outside Anders Halvorsen's home looked nothing like the land he had known the day before. The sand hills had vanished beneath mountains of wind-carved snow, sculpted into ridges and valleys, as if a giant hand had raked across the prairie in the night. But Anders did not step outside immediately. He first stood at his window, breath stilling as he took in the devastation. Snowdrifts reached the eaves of nearby cabins. Fences were swallowed whole. The very shape of the land had changed. Inside, the straw-bale walls remained warm to the touch. But outside was the aftermath of a battlefield. The first knock at 6:40 a.m., a weak, frantic pounding struck his door. Anders rushed to open it. A blast of cold air knifed into the room. Standing in the threshold, barely upright, was Jim Caldwell, face pale grey from cold, his beard crusted with ice. In his arms, wrapped in blankets stiff with frost, he held his youngest boy. "Anders," Caldwell's voice cracked. "Please." The boy's feet had gone numb. His small hands hung limp. Without hesitation, Anders pulled them both inside, shouting to his wife to bring blankets and warm water. He guided Caldwell to the fire, the man collapsing beside it with a shuddering exhale. Caldwell looked around the room in disbelief. The still air, the steady heat, the absence of drafts. "How are you warm?" he whispered. Anders placed a hand on the wall. "The land provides if we listen to it." More survivors in the snow a moment later. Another figure appeared through the thick haze of blowing powder. Anders squinted. Amelia Vance, the schoolteacher, stumbling forward with both arms wrapped around her chest. Her house had lost an entire wall. She had walked through waist-deep drifts, guided only by the faint glow of Anders's chimney. When she crossed the threshold, the heat hit her like a physical force. Tears filled her eyes immediately, not from emotion, but from the sudden thaw of frozen skin. I thought I wouldn't make it," she gasped. Anders helped her remove her frozen coat and guided her toward the hearth. He turned again toward the prairie. "Others are coming," he said quietly. "They must be." The stream of refugees grows over the next 20 minutes. 3 more families emerged out of the swirling fog, moving slowly, bodies hunched, faces hollowed by cold and exhaustion. The Schmidt family arrived carrying their youngest daughter, her lips pale blue. The father shook violently. The result of hours spent chipping frost off the inside walls of their dugout in a desperate attempt to save her. Behind them came the German settlers, barely recognizable beneath layers of torn wool. Their sod house had collapsed entirely. The father's hands were blackening from frostbite. Anders's home, mocked only months earlier, became the only sanctuary for miles. He ushered every one of them inside. Not a single person he turned away. Not one question asked. His home, built of grass and mud, sheltered 14 souls by mid-morning. 7 adults, 7 children. The room filled with steam as frozen clothes thawed. Soft crying from children mixed with the crackling of the fire. Anders walked among them, checking frostbitten fingers, offering warm broth, ensuring no one drifted into the dangerous sleep of hypothermia. The contrast they could not ignore as the survivors recovered. Their eyes widened. Every time, in disbelief, there was no ice on Anders's walls. No wind sneaking under the eaves. No roar of the blizzard inside. Only steady warmth. As if the storm had never touched the structure. The German father, his voice trembling, whispered, "I would not have believed this, if I had not felt it myself." Amelia Vance held her hands to the warm plastered wall. "It's quiet," she said, like the storm was somewhere else. Even Caldwell, pride humbled but not broken, looked around as if seeing the world new. "You saved us, Anders," he said softly. But Anders shook his head. "The walls saved you. I simply built them." A dangerous decision by late morning. The wind weakened further. Anders knew he needed to check the homesteads, to see whether any families had been trapped or were still missing. "I'm going out," he told his wife. She stepped closer, fear tightening her voice. "Anders, please. The snow is too deep." He touched her shoulder gently. "If someone is still alive out there, they won't last long. I must try." He wrapped himself in his thickest coat, slung a rope around his waist, and took a lantern for visibility. Before stepping out, he turned to the group sitting near the fire. "Stay close to the walls. They will hold." And then he pushed into the blinding white. Loss and revelation. Anders trudged through drifts taller than his waist. He reached Caldwell's cabin first, completely rimed in ice. The interior coated in a glittering shell that reflected the weak morning sun like cracked glass. He climbed to the sod house next. The roof lay flat. Branches and grass scattered across the snow like broken bones. Anders closed his eyes for a moment, knowing the family had escaped by only minutes. Finally, he made his way to the dugout. The entrance was half sealed by a frozen wave of wind-packed snow. Inside, the walls glistened with thick sheets of ice. It felt less like a home than a frozen tomb. He returned to his own home shaken. When he entered, the warmth struck him again, the same warmth all the others had felt. He stood silently in the doorway, staring at the thick golden walls. The truth settled over him like a weight. If not for this house, these people would have died. Not because he was smarter, not because he was lucky, but because he had dared to build differently, against mockery, against tradition, against fear. Anders learns what his walls truly mean as evening approached. The storm clouds finally began to lift, revealing a sky bruised purple and gold. Families huddled gratefully around Anders's fire. Children slept in safety. Anders looked at them and felt something shift inside him. He had not just built a house. He had built a refuge, a defiance of the old ways, a lesson in humility for an entire settlement, a testament to the power of observation over tradition. As he watched the children sleep, he knew this winter would be remembered, and so would the house that survived it. The morning of January 23rd broke clear but bitter, sunlight cutting through the fading storm like a blade. The sky glowed pale, yellow behind wisps of retreating clouds. The prairie, what could be seen of it, was no longer a land but an enormous, frozen sea. Anders Halvorsen stood outside his home, boots sinking into snow that came up past his knees. For a moment he simply breathed, watching steam drift from his mouth in slow, ghostly curls. His breath was the only thing moving in the stillness. Behind him, 14 survivors rested in the warm glow of his straw-bale walls. Ahead of him lay the shattered remains of a community. He began to walk. The silent ruins, the first place he checked was Caldwell's cabin. What had once been a proud log home, built with traditions carried across generations, now looked like the ribcage of a frozen animal. Frost coated every interior log. The north wall leaned inward, bowed nearly a handspan from the storm's relentless pressure. The stone chimney had cracked clean down the middle, a jagged line of failure from roofline to hearth. Anders brushed his fingers across the icy interior, astonished by how cold the stones felt, even through gloves. He whispered, "This wall took more heat from them than it gave." He closed the door gently, though it no longer fit its frame. The frame house. Barely a wreck next he headed toward Amelia Vance's frame house. Only half the structure remained. The entire north wall was gone, scattered in splintered planks across the snow as though thrown by a giant hand. The stove lay tipped over, its iron belly filled with snow. He imagined Amelia huddled inside during the storm, hearing her house creak like a ship in heavy seas. He imagined the terror. He imagined her running toward his faint chimney glow, every step a risk of never rising again. Snow crunched behind him. He turned to see Amelia, standing some distance away, wrapped in one of the quilts his wife had given her. She stared at the ruin of her home, not crying, not speaking, just absorbing the truth. "It's gone," she finally whispered. Anders nodded. "But you're not." The dugouts. Frozen prisons reaching the dugouts was harder. Snow had drifted so deeply around them that Anders had to cut steps into the hardened crust just to approach the entrances. Inside, the air held the stale, metallic cold of a freezer. Ice coated the interior walls in sheets so thick they shone like mirrors. Anders felt a chill, not from temperature, but from recognition. This could have taken them, he murmured. He remembered the Schmidt girl unconscious from cold. He remembered the tremor in the father's voice. He remembered the panic in the mother's eyes. The dugout had not sheltered them. It had nearly been their grave. He stepped back into the sunlight, blinking hard. The sod house. A total collapse finally, he made his way to the German family's sod house. But house no longer applied. What remained was a circular depression filled with broken blocks of frozen earth and a collapsed mass of half-buried timbers. It was difficult even to recognize the space where a family had once lived, cooked, prayed, slept. A small patch of fabric fluttered weakly in the breeze, part of a baby blanket, wedged under a clump of frozen soil. Anders crouched and pulled it free. The wall was stiff with ice. He stood there for a long time, holding the little blanket in both hands. "They escaped by minutes," he said quietly. Minutes. Returning to the warmth when Anders returned to his own home. Heat washed over him, as if greeting a returning wanderer. The survivors looked up anxiously. "How bad is it?" Caldwell asked. Anders sat beside the fire, thawing the frost from his beard, and answered honestly. Most homes cannot be lived in again until spring. Some will never stand another season. A heavy silence fell. Children looked at their parents. Parents looked at Anders. Anders looked at the shining walls of straw and clay that held them all without effort. Amelia finally broke the silence. Anders, why is your house still standing? Why were you warm while we froze? What did you understand that we didn't? Explaining the impossible, he took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. It wasn't strength that saved us, it was insulation. Thick walls. No drafts. A structure that doesn't fight the wind, but ignores it. He tapped the plastered wall behind him. Every bale is millions of hollow stems. Air trapped in those stems doesn't move. And still air is the best protection against cold. The survivors leaned in, mesmerized. Caldwell frowned. But it's just hay. It's prairie grass, Anders corrected. Dried. Compressed. Locked together. The land gives us what we need if we stop trying to build Kentucky cabins on Nebraska soil. He looked around the room at the exhausted faces. At the families who owed their lives to this strange, thick-walled experiment. That storm didn't test our strength, he said. It tested our assumptions. The hardest realization as the morning sun crept across the straw-plastered wall, warming the room even further, the settlers began to understand. Tradition hadn't failed. It simply didn't belong here. The land had its own rules. And Anders Halvorsen had been the only one willing to listen. He saw the mixture of emotions on their faces, gratitude, awe, shame, bewilderment. And beneath it all, a dawning recognition that their future homes could not look like their past ones. A new beginning inside the ruin. Amelia finally spoke again. Her voice small but steady. When spring comes, I won't rebuild the old way. Teach me, Anders. Teach us all. Caldwell looked down at his hands, rough and cracked. I mocked you, he admitted quietly. But you saved my boy. I'll learn whatever you're willing to teach. Anders felt a strange warmth rise in his chest, a mix of pride and humility. I will teach you, he said. Every part of it. He looked again at his walls, the walls that had kept his family alive, and now, an entire settlement. Because now it was clear, this was no longer just his home. It was the blueprint for their survival. The storm had passed, but the questions had not. By the time sunlight fully filled Anders Halvorsen's home, the survivors had gathered around him in a semicircle, some seated on the floor, some wrapped in blankets. All of them gazing at the thick straw-plastered walls with a mix of awe and confusion. Anders rested his hands on his knees, warming them near the fire. For the first time since the night of the blizzard, he allowed himself to exhale fully. He had saved lives, but the people he rescued now needed something else: understanding. Without it, nothing would change. Why his walls held when others failed. Caldwell cleared his throat, voice rough from smoke and frostbite. Anders, give it to us straight. What made this house stand when ours failed? Anders nodded slowly. It comes down to three things: insulation, airtightness, and thermal mass. Blank stares met his explanation. He smiled faintly and tapped the wall behind him. Let me show you. He peeled off a bit of loose straw from a corner and held it between his fingers. This, what you call hay, is millions of hollow grass stems. Each stem traps still air. Still air is nature's best insulator. Not logs. Not sod. Air. He handed the straw to Amelia Vance. She turned it between her fingers in wonder. So, every bale is full of tiny air pockets? She asked. Yes, Anders replied. And they don't move. Heat can't escape easily through still air. Caldwell scratched his beard, squinting. But my cabin had thick logs. Logs conduct heat, Anders said gently. Grass traps it. A murmur spread through the room. Why cold could not enter? Anders placed his palm against the warm wall. Second, airtightness. I sealed these walls like an eggshell. The plaster stops all drafts. A house doesn't lose heat evenly. It leaks from gaps. Tiny cracks become wind tunnels in a storm. The German father, his hands wrapped in cloth, nodded sadly. Our sod house. The gaps opened after the freeze. They always do, Anders said softly. Sod depends on moisture to hold together. The freeze-thaw cycle tears it apart. Amelia shivered at the memory. My frame house practically inhaled snow. That's because the boards shrink in cold, Anders replied. Yours didn't fail because you built poorly. It failed because lumber behaves differently here. He pointed to the thick walls once more. These walls don't shrink or swell. They stay as tight on a cold night as on a warm one. Why his home stayed warm all night finally? Anders rapped his knuckles lightly on the bale wall. Third, thermal mass. These bales store heat during the day, and release it slowly at night. Even during the blizzard, the temperature indoors didn't drop more than a few degrees. Caldwell looked stunned. You mean the walls themselves give off heat? Yes, Anders said. Not by burning, by releasing what they've stored. Like a stone warmed by the sun. But far more efficient. The numbers they never understood. Anders grabbed a stick and drew on the packed dirt floor. This wall is about 2 feet thick. It gives an insulation value, what engineers call an R value, of around 50. He drew another thin line. Your log walls? Maybe R5. Your frame house? R2 at best. A stunned hush filled the room. 10 times better. 20 times better. Enough to keep 14 people alive, while other homes froze from the inside. The Schmidt mother placed a hand over her mouth, tears forming. Our dugout walls. The ice kept growing thicker. Because cold earth radiates faster than your fire could replace the heat, Anders explained gently. Once the walls froze, your home became an icebox. She nodded slowly, understanding at last why the fire never warmed them. The power of listening to the land. Anders leaned back, letting his words settle. I didn't invent this, he said quietly. I just paid attention. Norway taught me to build with what the land gives, not what tradition demands. Back home, we built thick, insulated walls because our lives depended on it. He gestured toward the prairie outside. These hills don't have timber. They don't have dense sod. But they have grass, endless grass, and clay. Enough to build a fortress if a man is willing to think differently. Caldwell let out a long breath. I mocked you for months, he said. But the truth is, none of us understood the land. You understand it now, Anders replied. A settler people brought to humility. For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled softly. The storm's distant winds moaned across the hills. Inside, the room seemed to breathe warmth and quiet. Then Amelia asked the question they were all thinking. Anders, will you teach us? All of us? So we don't make the same mistakes when we rebuild. His eyes softened. I'll teach you everything I know. Every technique. Every mixture of plaster. Every trick for sealing walls. We'll build homes that belong to this land, not the lands we left behind. The shift in the room. The survivors didn't cheer. They didn't stand. They didn't speak right away. But Anders saw it, the change. These were no longer families clinging to the past. They were pioneers ready to build their future with new wisdom. And his home, the one they mocked, would become the template that saved an entire settlement. The weight of what had happened as evening light filtered through the thick walls. Anders looked around his one-room refuge. Children slept peacefully. Parents whispered softly. The air remained warm and calm. He realized then, the blizzard had not just tested their homes. It had tested their beliefs. Only one structure had passed. And it stood because one man dared to ask a simple question. What if the land knows better than tradition? Winter did not end with the blizzard. January faded into February with a steadiness that chilled even seasoned settlers. The cold remained sharp enough to bite exposed skin. The winds still prowled across the hills like restless wolves. But something in the community had shifted, quietly, profoundly, because Anders Halvorsen's home now stood at the center of their survival. Inside the straw-bale walls, Anders still rose before dawn each day. He checked the fire, inspected the plaster for new cracks, measured the settling of the roof beams. His hands remained steady, but his mind was busier than ever. 14 people shared his home now. 14 lives held together by grass, mud, and a willingness to build differently. And each morning, as he stepped outside, Anders saw the same thing. Neighbors waiting. Not just for warmth, but for knowledge. A new kind of gathering. The first came on February 2nd. Caldwell knocked on the door at sunrise, hat in his hands. Pride set aside. Anders, if you're willing, show me how to make that plaster mix again. The next morning, Amelia Vance asked for help sketching a wall layout. The day after that, the Schmidt family wanted to know how to reinforce a bale archway. By mid-February, the Halvorsen home had become something Anders never expected. A school. A meeting hall. A rebuilding workshop in the heart of a brutal winter. Children played at one end of the room. Adults sat by the fire with Anders, listening as he explained the logic of his walls, the way heat moved through still air, the reason a roof needed less timber when supported by broad bale pillars. As they listened, Anders saw the spark forming, the same spark that had driven him to build differently in the first place. Walking the ruins together when the weather allowed, Anders led small groups on walks through the snow to study the ruins, not to shame them, but to teach. He stood beside Caldwell's log cabin, tapping the split chimney. Stone holds cold, he explained. If it touches the outside wind, the cold enters your home. At Amelia's collapsed wall, he ran his hand over the shattered planks. This lumber wasn't seasoned for prairie winters. It shrinks. It cracks. It leaves openings the wind will always find. In the dugout, he pointed to the ice sheets still clinging to the walls. Moisture doesn't escape underground. It freezes. And once it freezes, it kills. The settlers listened with new humility. Their eyes followed his every gesture. Their boots creaked softly on the snow as they absorbed the lessons their suffering had carved into them. The quiet influence of Anders, what surprised Anders most wasn't how quickly the community learned. It was how deeply they trusted him now. He had been the outsider, the odd man stacking hay while others built real homes. The man they joked about at the mercantile. Now, when he spoke, they leaned in. When he pointed, they nodded. When he smiled, they smiled with him. But Anders felt no pride in their reverence. Only responsibility. He often sat late by the fire after the house had gone quiet, running a hand along the warm wall beside him. I did not build this to lead anyone, he murmured. I built it because it made sense. Yet the role had found him. Planning for spring. A village reborn by late February, the settlers began planning for the thaw. They gathered around Anders's table, spreading hand-drawn diagrams and small wooden models. Caldwell traced a rectangle with his finger. If we double the wall thickness, could we build a two-room place? Anders nodded. With enough pins and proper staggering, yes. Amelia pointed to her sketch. I want windows, real windows. Can bale walls support that? They can, Anders said. If we frame them correctly. The Schmidt family wanted a central hearth. The German family wanted larger eaves. Others asked about storage lofts, root cellars, attached sheds. And Anders answered every question with calm patience, guiding without forcing. We build what suits the land, he told them. Not what suits tradition. Respect where there once was mockery one evening, after a long day of planning. Caldwell lingered by the door as the others prepared to leave. Anders, he said, voice quieter than usual. I owe you more than I can say. Anders shook his head. You owe me nothing, Jim. No, Caldwell insisted. I spent months calling your home foolish. But you saved my boy. My family. This whole settlement. Anders placed a hand on the man's shoulder. Jim, you survived. That's what matters. We all learn from the land. Some of us sooner, some later. There's no shame in that. Caldwell nodded slowly, eyes shining. Still, I'm glad you're our neighbor. The warmest house in the Sand Hills, March arrived with unpredictable thawing and refreezing. Yet Anders's house remained warm and dry. The fire burned low most days, barely needed at all. The walls held heat, as if storing the memory of the sun. The children of the settlement often gathered there, laughing, playing, filling the room with the sound of new hope. Sometimes, Anders stood in the doorway and simply watched them, knowing that not one of them would be alive if he had chosen to build the way everyone expected him to. The wisdom that settled in the community by the time the snow melted enough to expose the hills again. One truth had spread through Cherry County. Anders hadn't just built a house. He had revealed a way forward, a method adapted to the land, a technique strong enough for the harshest winter, a wisdom deeper than tradition, a path towards survival, not just for a season, but for generations. And in the quiet warmth of his home, Anders Halvorsen understood. The blizzard had taken much, but it had given something priceless in return, a community awakened. A lesson carved into winter itself. Spring did not so much arrive in the Sand Hills as slowly reveal itself. Snow receded grudgingly, pulling back from the land like a tide unsure of whether to return. But by late March, patches of earth began showing through the drifts, and the prairie grass, bent, brittle, but alive, reached for the sun again. For the settlers of Cherry County, this thaw meant one thing, rebuilding. And every step of that process led them back to one man, to one set of walls, to one idea that had saved 14 lives. Anders Halvorsen's straw-bale home. The first family builds anew. The Schmidts were the first to begin. Their dugout, still half filled with ice, offered nothing salvageable. So one clear morning, they came to Anders with sleeves rolled up and determination in their eyes. We are ready, Mr. Schmidt said. Tell us where to start. Anders walked them to a patch of level ground near their old homestead. He knelt and drew in the softening earth with a stick. A raised foundation, he said. 8 inches off the ground. Stone or compacted gravel. Moisture is our enemy. The Schmidts listened with the reverence usually given to a preacher. Children gathered grass bundles. Mr. Schmidt sorted stones. Mrs. Schmidt mixed clay with chopped straw for the plaster, following Anders's instructions precisely. As the first course of bales went down, heavy, square, tightly compressed, Mr. Schmidt looked up, breathless. It feels solid, he said. Anders nodded. It is. And it will stay that way. A teacher rebuilds her life. Next came Amelia Vance. Her old frame house was a wrecked skeleton of splintered planks. She stood beside the ruins, hands clasped, as Anders surveyed the site. Do you want to build here? He asked gently. Amelia hesitated, then shook her head. This place holds a memory I don't want to relive. Anders pointed to a small ridge nearby. Build on higher ground. Fewer drifts. More sunlight. Together they marked the footprint of her new home. This time, she wanted windows, real ones, with deep sills set into the bale walls. When Anders showed her how to notch the bales with a timber frame, she watched every movement carefully, her brow furrowed with concentration. I used to teach books, she said softly. Now I learn from grass. Anders smiled. The best textbooks are written by the land. Caldwell's redemption for Jim Caldwell. Rebuilding was not just a task, it was penance. He stood before Anders with humility Anders had never seen from him before. I'll work every daylight hour, he said. Just help me build something that won't fail my family again. So Anders guided him step by step. How to stagger the bales in a running bond pattern. How to drive pins through multiple courses for stability. How to use clay plaster in 3 coats, scratch, brown, and finish. How to position the hearth at the center of the home, not the north wall. Caldwell followed every instruction without complaint, without shortcuts, without pride. One evening, as the walls reached shoulder height, he stopped and looked up at Anders, voice thick with emotion. I mocked you, he said. But this is good work. Anders clapped him on the back. You're a good man, Jim. Winter just needed to teach us both. A community learns together by early May. New structures began rising across the landscape. Not log cabins, not sod houses, not dugouts. Bale houses. Thick-walled. Plastered. Fortress-like. Each one slightly different. Reflecting the needs of its family, but sharing the same core principles Anders had introduced. The prairie, once dotted with fragile wooden shacks and pits dug into hillsides, now looked stronger, steadier, more rooted to the land. Even the children joined the work, carrying small armloads of grass, stamping clay with bare feet, laughing as they mimicked Anders's calm instructions. Some days, Anders stood at a distance just to watch. Caldwell shaping a doorway. Amelia smoothing a plaster coat by lantern light. The Schmidt family raising their roof beams as neighbors cheered them on. It struck him then. The storm had not destroyed their community. It had remade it. Anders builds more than homes, though he never sought leadership. Anders became the axis around which the settlement turned. People asked him about roof pitch for wind resistance, a bale density for optimal insulation, how to prevent moisture wicking, how to orient homes to maximize winter sunlight. He answered every question with patience, humility, and the quiet confidence of someone who had long trusted the land more than tradition. One warm evening, as spring finally broke fully across the prairie, Amelia approached him as he stood watching the sun set behind the dunes. You know, she said softly, in 100 years, people might talk about this. About you. Anders chuckled under his breath. No, he replied. They'll talk about the houses. That's enough. The sound of a new beginning by June. 7 new bale homes stood proudly across Cherry County. Sturdy, warm, beautiful in their simplicity. The air filled with the sounds of hammering, laughter, and plans for the future. Prairie winds swept across the grass, bending it like waves around the new structures. Anders walked among them one evening, lantern in hand, examining each wall, each seam, each plaster coat. There was still work to do, but it was good work. Hopeful work. As he stood on a rise overlooking the valley, lantern glowing against the darkening sky, he realized something profound. The storm had proven the strength of his walls, but spring had proven the strength of his community. And for the first time since arriving in the Sand Hills, Anders felt not like a stranger or an outsider, but like a builder of something lasting, something worthy, something that began with a single question the land had answered. What if the simplest material could save the most lives?